The first thing Grandma noticed was that I stepped out of an Uber instead of my SUV. She was standing just inside the private dining room at Rosewood, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, silver bracelets catching the chandelier light. 40 relatives were already seated or drifting between tables, talking too loudly, laughing too easily. The kind of family noise that always made me feel like I was standing outside a window looking in. Her eyes landed on me at once. "Arya," she said, puzzled. "Why are you coming in an Uber? What happened to the SUV we gave you for your 24th birthday?" I stopped in the doorway. For one suspended second, the whole room seemed to tilt. Before I could answer, my mother smiled from across the table, calm and polished, as if she'd been waiting for the question. Her sister needed it more. That was all she said at first. But in my family, that sentence explained everything. Madison has a husband. Madison has a little boy. Madison has a life people recognize. I'm single, work from home, and somehow that has always made my time, my needs, and even my belongings feel easier for other people to rearrange. A few relatives nodded like Mom had said something generous. Someone murmured, "That was sweet of you, Arya." Sweet. I felt my fingers tighten around the strap of my purse. I could still see my SUV outside in the parking lot, 3 spaces from the entrance, with my sister's toddler car seat strapped into the back and a sticker on the rear window I had never bought. I didn't correct my mother. Not yet. Because Grandma was still looking at me, not at her, and there was something in her face I couldn't quite name. Not confusion exactly. Not anger either. Recognition. As if she had just realized the story being told in front of her was not the truth. And if you know what it feels like when family makes decisions about your life and calls it love, stay with me. Subscribe. Power moves quietly. I drew in a slow breath, stepped fully into the room, and understood with sudden clarity that this dinner was no longer just a birthday party. It was the night everything would finally be seen. I had almost turned around in the parking lot before walking into that restaurant. Not because I didn't want to celebrate my grandmother's 70th birthday. If anything, she was the only reason I came at all. But standing there beside the curb, watching my own SUV parked near the entrance with Madison climbing out of the driver's seat, something inside my chest had tightened in a way that felt hard to breathe through. Madison hadn't even noticed me at first. She was busy adjusting Ethan's tiny jacket while Derek wrestled the toddler out of the back seat. The car door swung open, and I saw the inside of the vehicle that used to belong entirely to me. My music settings were gone. My small lavender air freshener was gone. In its place sat a bright plastic dinosaur cup rolling across the floor, and the bulky gray car seat strapped behind the passenger side. It looked like someone else's life had moved into my space. Then Madison glanced up and waved. "Arya, you made it." Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't been driving my car for 3 weeks. "Did you Uber?" she asked casually as I walked closer. Her tone wasn't mocking. If anything, it sounded relieved, as if the logistics had worked out exactly the way she hoped. "Yeah," I said. "Convenient, right?" She smiled, adjusting Ethan's sleeve. "Totally." I nodded slowly. Convenient. That word had become my family's favorite way of describing things that weren't convenient for me at all. Derek gave me an awkward half-wave while shifting Ethan to his shoulder. "Good to see you, Arya." "You too." Madison locked the SUV with a cheerful beep and slipped the keys into her purse. My keys. The small silver compass charm I had bought at a flea market dangled from the ring. I recognized the soft chime immediately. For a moment I thought about saying something right there in the parking lot. Just 3 words. "That's my car." But Ethan started whining and Madison turned toward the restaurant entrance. "Mom's been stressing about the seating chart all day," she said. "We should go in before she has a meltdown." And just like that, the moment passed. I followed them inside. Because this was how things usually worked in my family. Confrontation was postponed. Assumptions filled the silence. And the person who lost something was expected to adjust. But that night something felt different. Grandma had seen me arrive in an Uber. And Grandma noticed things most people missed. If you're listening right now, tell me something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city below. Sometimes the quiet ones in a family notice more than anyone realizes. My grandmother was one of them. And that night, she was paying very close attention. The rosewood always felt a little too elegant for my family. Crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths so stiff they barely moved when someone brushed against them. Waiters who appeared silently and refilled glasses before anyone asked. It was the kind of place people chose when they wanted a celebration to feel important. Mom had rented the entire private dining room. 40 guests. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years, plus a few of Grandma's old friends who remembered stories from long before I was born. I slipped into the seat at the far end of the long table. Not assigned there officially. It just seemed to happen that way every time. The quieter daughter. The extra chair. Madison sat closer to Mom, of course. Ethan's high chair was squeezed beside her while Derek balanced a glass of water and tried to keep the toddler entertained with a folded napkin. Mom was glowing with the energy she always had during big family events. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. Perfect control of the room. Everyone, don't forget we'll do cake after the main course, she announced cheerfully. And Uncle Robert has a toast prepared. People laughed. Glasses clinked. Conversations overlapped. From the outside, it probably looked like a warm, loving family dinner. Grandma sat at the head of the table, watching everything quietly. She didn't speak much during the first hour. But she noticed. Grandma noticed when Madison mentioned how helpful the SUV had been lately with daycare pickups. She noticed when Mom told someone across the table, Arya works from home so transportation isn't really an issue for her. She noticed the way I stayed mostly quiet. And she noticed every single time my eyes drifted toward Madison's purse where the keys rested. I tried to focus on small talk with a cousin beside me. So you're still writing? She asked. Yeah. Freelance content work mostly. That's nice, she said politely, in the way people say nice when they don't really understand what you do. Across the table, Ethan dropped a spoon. Mom immediately stood up to help Madison. It was automatic. Always had been. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Years of practice had made that easy. Because the truth is, when you grow up as the flexible one, you learn early that making a scene never ends well. So you adapt. You stay quiet. You tell yourself it's easier. But sometimes silence builds pressure inside you that doesn't release until something breaks. Or until someone finally asks the right question. And that question came halfway through dinner. Grandma set down her fork, looked directly at me, and changed the entire direction of the night. Before we get there, let me ask you something. What would you have done in my place? Stayed quiet like I did? Or spoken up sooner? I didn't know it yet. But the moment Grandma opened her mouth, the story my mother had been telling everyone was about to fall apart. The room had just settled into that comfortable rhythm dinners sometimes reach. Plates half finished, conversations softening, glasses refilled. Someone at the far end of the table laughing a little too loudly at Uncle Robert's story about a fishing trip from 20 years ago. I remember staring down at my plate when it happened. Grandma set her fork down gently. Not loud. Not dramatic. But somehow the small sound pulled my attention instantly. When I looked up, she was already looking at me. Arya, sweetheart. Her voice wasn't sharp, just curious. I noticed you arrived alone tonight. 40 conversations softened slightly. Not silent yet, just quieter. Then she asked the question. Where's that beautiful SUV we gave you for your birthday? The room went still. It was the kind of silence that moves like a ripple across a table. One conversation ending, then another, until everyone's attention lands in the same place. On me. My heart thudded once. Hard. I opened my mouth to answer. But my mother spoke first. Oh, Arya gave it to Madison. Her voice was bright, almost proud. Madison froze beside her. Mom continued smoothly, like she was explaining something obvious. Madison has Ethan now. You know how much running around that involves. Daycare, doctor appointments. It just made more sense. Several relatives nodded. Someone murmured, That's very generous. Mom smiled toward them, pleased. Arya's always been very understanding. Understanding. That word landed strangely in my chest. I hadn't given anything away. No one had even asked me. Across the table, Madison's eyes flicked toward me for a brief second. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to uncertainty. But she didn't correct Mom. Neither did anyone else. Because from the outside, the story sounded reasonable. A younger sister helping her older sister with a child. Family supporting family. It was a good story. The only problem was that it wasn't true. Grandma didn't nod along with the others. She didn't smile. She didn't look at Mom at all. Her eyes stayed on me. Careful. Steady. You gave it away? She asked. Her voice had changed slightly. Not louder. Just clearer. Across the table, my mother laughed lightly. Of course she did, Mom. Arya knows Madison needs it more. But Grandma still hadn't looked away from me. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath. And in that quiet space, something inside me shifted. Because for the first time that night, someone wasn't answering for me. Someone was waiting for my answer. If you've ever been in a room where people talk about you like you're not even there, you know how strange that moment feels when someone finally asks you instead. Grandma tilted her head slightly. Arya, she said softly, did you give it away? Or was it taken? For a moment I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat. Grandma's question hung in the air like something fragile that could shatter if anyone moved too quickly. Did you give it away? Or was it taken? My mother's smile faltered. Only slightly. But I saw it. A funny question, Mom, she said lightly, reaching for her glass of wine. Of course Arya gave it. She's not a child. A few people chuckled politely, eager for the tension to dissolve. But Grandma still hadn't looked away from me. 40 faces shifted between the two of us. Waiting. My throat felt tight. Across the table, my mother's eyes met mine. The look was familiar. A quiet warning. Don't complicate things. Don't embarrass the family. Don't make this difficult. For most of my life, that look had been enough to silence me. But something about the way Grandma was watching, patient, calm, almost protective, made it harder to hide behind the usual answers. I swallowed. No one asked me, I said. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. But it was steady. I was told Madison needed to borrow it for a week. The room went completely still. A fork clinked softly against someone's plate. Grandma's eyebrows lifted just slightly. A week, she repeated. I nodded. That was 3 weeks ago. Across the table, my mother pushed back her chair suddenly. This is really unnecessary, she said with a strained laugh. It's just a family misunderstanding. But Grandma didn't respond to her. She was still looking at me. And you've asked for it back? She asked gently. Yes. And? I hesitated. Then said the word that had followed me most of my life. Mom said Madison needed it more. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. My mother's voice sharpened. Arya works from home, she said quickly, addressing the table now instead of Grandma. She barely drives. Madison has a toddler. She gestured toward Ethan, who was happily chewing on a breadstick and completely unaware that his existence had become part of the argument. I made a practical decision. Grandma finally turned her head toward my mother. Slowly. Her expression had changed. Not angry. Not yet. But the softness had disappeared. A practical decision, she repeated quietly. Mom nodded, relieved to finally have Grandma's attention. Yes, Madison has responsibilities. Arya is young, single, flexible. Flexible. The word landed like a stone in the center of the table. For a second, no one spoke. Then Grandma set both hands on the tablecloth and said something so calm, so unexpected, that several people actually gasped. Linda, she said to my mother, did you forget whose money bought that car? For a moment, my mother didn't answer. It was the first time all evening she looked unsure of what to say next. Around the table, several relatives shifted in their seats. Conversations that had quietly resumed now stopped again. My mom let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they want to make something sound harmless. "Mom, what kind of question is that?" she said. "We bought the car for Arya's birthday. You know that." Grandma didn't smile. She sat back in her chair slowly, folding her hands in front of her like someone preparing to explain something very simple. "No," she said calmly. "I gave you the money to buy that car." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. I blinked. "What?" Across the table, my mother's jaw tightened. "That was just part of the family trust," she said quickly. "You offered to help." "I did," Grandma agreed. Her voice stayed even, almost gentle. But I remember the conversation very clearly. She turned slightly so the whole table could hear her. "Linda came to me before Arya's birthday last year and asked for money to buy her younger daughter a proper gift." Grandma's eyes moved briefly toward me. She said Arya had often felt overlooked growing up. My chest tightened. I hadn't expected those words to be spoken out loud in a room full of relatives. Some of the cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances. My mother shifted in her seat. "Mother, this really isn't necessary." But Grandma continued. "She said she wanted to do something meaningful to show Arya that she mattered just as much as Madison." No one laughed now. Even Madison looked confused. "Wait," she said softly, looking between them. "Mom, what is she talking about?" My mother ignored her. "That was private family business," she snapped quietly toward Grandma. Grandma tilted her head. "You made it public the moment you told everyone Arya gave that car away." A murmur passed through the table. Because suddenly the story Mom had told earlier didn't feel so clean anymore. Grandma turned her gaze back to my mother. "And you promised something in return for that money." My mother's shoulders stiffened. "Mother, you signed a paper," Grandma said. The room froze. My Uncle Robert slowly straightened in his chair. "What paper?" he asked carefully. Grandma didn't raise her voice. But every word carried. "A document stating that the car would belong to Arya." She paused. "Only Arya." I felt like the floor had shifted beneath me. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time in my life, I saw her looking genuinely cornered. Grandma glanced toward the far end of the table. "Robert," she said calmly, "did you bring the folder I asked you to bring tonight?" My uncle hesitated for half a second, then reached down beside his chair and lifted a plain manila envelope onto the table. If you've ever watched someone realize the truth they've been hiding is about to come out, you know the look that crosses their face. My mother had that look now. And the night wasn't even halfway over yet. "Stay with me, this is where everything truly began to change." Stand where integrity stands. Subscribe. The envelope looked ordinary. Plain manila, a metal clasp, the kind of folder you'd see in a dentist's office or a school administrator's desk. But the way my mother stared at it, you would have thought it contained something explosive. "Mother," she said quietly, leaning forward. "We can discuss this later." Grandma didn't move. "You had 3 weeks to discuss it later," she replied. My Uncle Robert slid the envelope toward her. The paper made a soft scraping sound against the white tablecloth. 40 people watched. Grandma opened the clasp slowly. Inside were several neatly stacked documents. I could feel the tension around the table building like pressure in a sealed room. Mom tried again. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice tightening. "It's just a misunderstanding about a car." Grandma lifted the first sheet and placed it on the table. "Robert," she said calmly, "please read the first line." Uncle Robert adjusted his glasses and picked up the document. He cleared his throat. "Vehicle registration," he read. A few relatives leaned forward. "State of California." He paused, scanning down the page. Then his eyebrows lifted. "Registered owner?" He glanced up briefly. "Eleanor Mitchell." Several people gasped. My stomach dropped. "Grandma's name." My mother jumped in quickly. "That's just for convenience," she said, her words rushing out. "For insurance purposes. Lots of families do that." Grandma didn't look at her. Continue, Robert. He turned to the next page. This appears to be a trust disbursement agreement. His voice slowed as he read. I, Linda Reynolds, acknowledge receiving $28,000 from the Mitchell Family Trust for the purchase of a vehicle intended as a birthday gift for my daughter, Arya Reynolds. My heart began to pound. Around the table, heads turned toward me. Robert continued. The vehicle will be registered under Eleanor Mitchell's name, but designated for the sole personal use of Arya Reynolds. He stopped. Then read the next line carefully. The vehicle cannot be loaned, transferred, or reassigned to any other family member without the explicit consent of Arya Reynolds. A low wave of whispers moved through the room. My mother's face had gone pale. That was just paperwork, she said quickly. It wasn't meant to be taken so literally. Grandma's voice cut through the murmurs. You signed it. Silence. Robert lowered the page slowly. I witnessed it, he added quietly. The room seemed to shrink around us. For the first time all evening, my sister spoke again. Mom, Madison said softly. Did you really sign that? My mother didn't answer. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need an explanation. It just sits there in black ink on white paper. And suddenly the story everyone believed begins to crack. If you're listening right now, I'm curious about something. When someone in your family crosses a boundary, do you confront it immediately? Or do you stay quiet to keep the peace? Tell me honestly in the comments. Because the next thing Grandma revealed didn't just change the story about the car. It changed the balance of power in our entire family. My mother looked around the table like she was searching for an ally. Anyone? My dad stared down at his plate. Derek suddenly seemed very interested in refilling Ethan's cup. And Madison. Madison looked like someone who had just realized a story she'd been living inside might not be true. Mom, she said again, quieter now, I didn't know about any of this. Grandma's gaze shifted to her. I believe you, she said. Then she asked the question that settled over the room like falling dust. But did you ask your sister before taking the car? Madison froze. Her lips parted slightly. Mom told me Arya was okay with it. Grandma didn't blink. That wasn't my question. Silence stretched. Madison's eyes moved toward me for the first time since the documents were read. Real uncertainty lived there now. No, she admitted. I didn't ask. Grandma nodded once. Not cruelly. Just acknowledging the truth. Then you assumed, she said. Madison looked down at her hands. Across the table, my mother finally lost patience. Oh, come on, she snapped. This is ridiculous. Several people flinched. It's a car, she continued, gesturing sharply. Madison has a child. Arya works from home. I made a practical decision for the family. Grandma turned toward her slowly. You made a decision about something that wasn't yours. It was a family gift. It was Arya's. My mother exhaled sharply. Mother, you're blowing this out of proportion. Grandma's voice stayed calm. You told this room that Arya gave the car away. Mom said nothing. Was that true? My mother crossed her arms. She wasn't using it. A few cousins exchanged glances. Because that wasn't the same answer. Grandma leaned slightly forward. So you decided she didn't deserve it. I never said that. You didn't need to. The air in the room felt heavy now. Like everyone had suddenly realized they were watching something far bigger than a disagreement about transportation. Grandma looked down at the documents again. There's one more paper in this folder, she said. My mother's shoulders stiffened instantly. Mother. Grandma ignored her. She slid the final sheet across the table toward Uncle Robert. Please read this one as well. Robert picked it up carefully. This appears to be a personal letter. My mother's face drained of color. Don't read that, she said quickly. Grandma didn't raise her voice. Read it. Robert hesitated for half a second. Then he began. I promise that the car purchased with these funds will remain Arya's and Arya's alone. His voice slowed as he continued. I understand that my younger daughter has often felt overlooked, and this gift is meant to show her she matters." The room went perfectly still, because those weren't Grandma's words. They were my mother's, written in her own handwriting, signed at the bottom. If you've ever had someone admit the truth in private and then pretend it never happened in public, you already know how heavy that moment feels. And the next thing Grandma said made the silence even deeper. No one spoke for several seconds after Uncle Robert finished reading. The room felt suspended in something heavier than silence, because the words were still sitting there on the table. Not opinions, not accusations, just my mother's handwriting. I understand that my younger daughter has often felt overlooked. My chest tightened hearing it out loud. Across the table, my mom looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. "That letter was private," she said finally. Her voice sounded thinner now. Grandma tilted her head slightly. "You wrote it to me. That doesn't mean you had to read it to everyone." "You told everyone Arya gave away her car," Grandma replied calmly. "You made this public." Several relatives nodded quietly. My mother's eyes flashed toward me. "You could have corrected the story earlier," she said sharply. "Instead, you waited until now to embarrass the entire family." For a moment, the old instinct kicked in, the one that had trained me my whole life to shrink, to apologize for tension I didn't create. But before I could speak, another voice cut across the table. "That's not fair." Everyone turned. It was Aunt Patricia. She stood slowly, resting both hands on the back of her chair. "I've been sitting here listening to this," she said, looking directly at my mother. "And you're doing the same thing you used to do when we were kids." My mother stared at her. "Patricia, stay out of this." "No." Her voice was calm but firm. "Not this time." The room shifted again, because suddenly this wasn't just about me. Patricia glanced toward me briefly, her expression softening. Then she looked back at my mom. "You remember how Mom and Dad always told me to be the flexible one?" she asked. My mother didn't answer. "I gave up the bigger bedroom, the later curfew, the nicer clothes." Her voice carried clearly across the table. "And every time I complained, I was told I should be more understanding." A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Patricia continued. "I spent years in therapy figuring out that pattern." My mom's jaw tightened. "That has nothing to do with Arya." Patricia shook her head slowly. "It has everything to do with Arya." Her hand gestured lightly toward me. "You're repeating the exact same thing." No one moved. Because once someone says the truth out loud, it becomes harder for everyone else to pretend they don't see it. Grandma placed a gentle hand on Patricia's arm. "This isn't about punishing anyone," she said. Her eyes moved slowly across the table. "It's about whether our family treats all its members with dignity." Then she turned to Madison. "My dear," she said quietly, "where are the keys?" For a moment, Madison didn't move. She sat perfectly still beside Ethan's high chair, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the table. Everyone was looking at her now. Grandma hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. "My dear," she repeated gently, "where are the keys?" Madison's eyes moved toward my mother. A silent question. Mom shook her head slightly. Just a small movement. But I saw it. So did Grandma. "Madison," Grandma said calmly, "this is not a punishment. It's simply the natural result of the truth." My sister inhaled slowly, then reached into her purse. The sound of metal against leather was strangely loud in the quiet room. When she pulled out the keychain, my chest tightened. The small silver compass charm swung gently beneath the keys. I had bought it at a flea market the week after getting the car. Something about it had felt symbolic back then. Direction. Movement. Freedom. Now it looked strangely out of place in Madison's hand. She stood, walked slowly around the table. Every step felt deliberate. When she reached me, she didn't meet my eyes at first. "I'm sorry, Arya," she said quietly. Her voice sounded different than it had earlier in the parking lot. Less confident. More honest. "I should have asked." Then she placed the keys in my palm. The metal felt warm. Familiar. Mine. For a second I didn't say anything. I just closed my fingers around them. Thank you, I said softly. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. Across the room, my mother shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with how the moment had unfolded. Grandma noticed. And Linda, she said. My mother stiffened immediately. Yes? Grandma folded her hands calmly on the table. You owe your daughter an apology. My mother exhaled sharply. Oh, for heaven's sake. Not for the car, Grandma continued. For treating her as if her voice didn't matter. The room held its breath again. My mother looked at me, then at the 40 people watching. Her pride and embarrassment seemed to wrestle across her face. Finally, she said, tight and clipped, Arya, I'm sorry I didn't ask first. It sounded more like a legal statement than a real apology. But strangely, I didn't feel the need to argue, because something more important had already happened tonight. People had seen the truth. Grandma leaned back slightly in her chair, satisfied. But she wasn't done yet. Before we finish dinner, she said calmly, there's one more thing we need to clarify. My mother groaned quietly. What now? Grandma looked around the table at all the grandchildren. Then she said something that changed the future of our family. From this point forward, I will manage the Mitchell Family Trust directly with each grandchild, not through their parents. The room went silent again, because everyone knew exactly what that meant. If you've ever watched someone lose control of the system they've used for years, you recognize that moment instantly. My mother recognized it too, and the look on her face said she hadn't seen this coming at all. If stories about quiet strength and standing your ground matter to you, this is where dignity is defended. Subscribe. For a moment, no one spoke. The words had landed so quietly that it took a few seconds for everyone in the room to understand what Grandma had just said. Then Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair slowly. Well, he said, folding his napkin neatly beside his plate. That seems fair. Across the table, Aunt Patricia nodded. Very fair. But my mother's face had gone completely still. You can't be serious, she said. Grandma looked at her calmly. I've never been more serious. Mom leaned forward. The trust has always been managed through the children, she argued. That's how it's always worked. Grandma tilted her head slightly. And how well did that system work for Arya? No one answered. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. This is an overreaction, she said. One disagreement about a car doesn't mean you rewrite the whole family structure. Grandma's voice remained calm. This isn't about a car. She gestured lightly toward the documents still lying on the table. It's about promises. Her eyes moved toward me briefly. And about making sure every grandchild is treated with the same respect. Several cousins exchanged looks, because the truth was obvious now. For years, requests for support from the trust had passed through parents first, which meant parents had quietly decided whose needs mattered most. Grandma continued. From now on, if any of you want help with education, housing, starting a business, or anything else. She glanced around the table. You speak to me directly. No intermediaries. No filters. No favoritism. My mother shook her head. This is going to create chaos. Grandma smiled faintly. No. It's going to create fairness. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then Madison spoke softly. Grandma. Everyone turned. She looked nervous, but grateful. Thank you. Grandma nodded once. You're welcome. Then she added something that made several people sit up straighter. And to be clear, this change isn't just about Arya. Her eyes moved across every grandchild at the table. It's about making sure none of you ever feel like you have to become invisible to keep the peace. The words settled gently into the room. Invisible. I felt that word in my chest, because that had been my role for most of my life. But something had shifted tonight. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just permanently. Dinner resumed after that, though the energy in the room had changed completely. Conversations were quieter. More thoughtful. And for the first time in years, people were actually asking me questions about my work, about my apartment, about my life. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I'm curious. When did you first realize it? Share your story below. Because sometimes the smallest moment of recognition can change everything. And that night, the real change was only beginning. The party technically continued after that. Cake arrived. Someone dimmed the lights. 40 voices sang "Happy Birthday" while Grandma smiled politely and blew out the candles. From the outside, it probably looked like the evening had returned to normal. But something fundamental had shifted in the room. You could feel it in the way conversations were quieter, in the way people glanced at me now and then, as if noticing me properly for the first time. Mom and Dad left early. They said goodbye to Grandma quickly, almost hurriedly, and avoided my side of the room entirely. Madison and Derek stayed a little longer, mostly because Ethan had fallen asleep against Derek's shoulder, and waking him seemed like more trouble than it was worth. But eventually the guests began to thin out. One by one. Coats pulled on. Hugs exchanged. Waiters clearing plates. I stepped outside into the cool night air and walked across the parking lot. The SUV was still parked exactly where Madison had left it. My SUV. For a moment I just stood there, looking at it. The reflection of the restaurant lights shimmered across the navy blue paint. 3 weeks. 3 weeks I had watched that car disappear from my life. 3 weeks of Uber rides and quiet frustration. 3 weeks of being told it wasn't a big deal. Now the keys rested in my hand again. I ran my fingers along the door handle slowly. Something about the moment felt strange. Not triumphant. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Like reclaiming a small piece of myself that had been misplaced. "You okay, sweetheart?" I turned. Aunt Patricia was walking toward me across the parking lot. "I think so," I said. She smiled gently. "You handled yourself well in there." I barely said anything. "That's not true," she said. "You told the truth. Sometimes that's the hardest thing." She reached out and hugged me. A real hug. Warm. Steady. "I'm proud of you, Arya." Those words caught me off guard more than everything else that had happened tonight. Proud. It wasn't a word I heard often growing up. Uncle Robert came out a few minutes later, jingling his car keys. He paused beside us. "Well?" he said with a crooked smile. "Welcome to the club." I blinked. "What club?" He chuckled. Not the favorite child club." Patricia laughed softly. "Meetings are informal." For the first time all night, I laughed too. Not because the situation was funny, but because the tension that had lived inside my chest for years felt just a little lighter. Then the restaurant doors opened again, and Grandma stepped outside. Slowly, carefully, but with the same quiet authority she'd carried all evening. "Arya," she called. "Come here a moment." I walked toward her, and what she said next would stay with me long after that night ended. Grandma was standing beside the entrance, her coat draped neatly over one arm. The restaurant lights glowed behind her, outlining the silver in her hair. For 70, she still carried herself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to stop rushing. "Drive safe tonight," she said. I nodded, still holding the keys in my hand. "Grandma, thank you." The words felt small compared to everything she had done. She tilted her head slightly. "Don't thank me." "Why not?" "Because I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said calmly. "I simply told the truth." I let out a soft breath. That truth changed a lot tonight. "Yes," she said. "It did." For a moment we both looked toward the parking lot where the SUV waited under the soft streetlights. Then she turned back to me. "You know why I paid for that car, don't you?" I hesitated. "I thought Mom did." Grandma smiled faintly. "That's what she wanted you to believe." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Why did you really buy it?" Grandma rested one hand gently on my shoulder. "Because I've been watching this family for a long time." Her voice stayed soft, but every word felt deliberate. I saw how easily you stepped aside for others. How often you made things easier for everyone else. She paused. And how rarely anyone stopped to ask what you needed. The honesty of it stung a little, but it also felt strangely comforting. You remind me of someone, she continued. Grandpa? She nodded. Your grandfather was the quiet one in his family, too. People underestimated him for years. A small smile crossed her face. Until they realized he had been paying attention the whole time. I glanced down at the keys again. So you knew something like this might happen? Grandma's eyes twinkled. I suspected it might. That's why you kept the title in your name. Yes. A cool breeze moved through the parking lot. Grandma adjusted her coat slightly. Listen carefully, Arya, she said. Being kind and being invisible are not the same thing. I felt that sentence settle somewhere deep inside me. You're allowed to take up space in your own life. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled gently and patted my arm. Now go home. I laughed softly. Yes, ma'am. As I opened the car door, she added one last thing. And Arya? I looked back. Next time someone tells you to be flexible. She gave a small, knowing smile. Remember, you also have the right to say no. I drove home that night with the windows down and the music louder than usual. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel like something I had to shrink myself to fit into. If quiet strength resonates with you, stand with us and subscribe. Because the calm ones don't always win loudly, but they do win in the end. The drive home that night felt different. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just lighter. The city lights blurred softly past the windshield as the music played through speakers that finally belonged to me again. For 3 weeks I had been opening the Uber app every time I needed to go somewhere, telling myself it didn't matter. But sitting behind the wheel again, I realized it had mattered more than I admitted. Because the car had never really been about transportation. It had been about ownership. About having something in my life that no one else could quietly rearrange. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, I didn't rush inside. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat for a minute, looking at the small compass charm hanging from the keys. I remembered buying it at a flea market the week after I got the SUV. The seller had said something strange when he handed it to me. Everyone needs a direction, he'd said. At the time, it sounded like one of those random comments strangers make. But tonight it felt oddly accurate. For years, my direction had been simple. Keep the peace. Stay flexible. Don't make things harder for everyone else. Tonight had cracked that pattern open. Not completely, but enough for me to see it clearly. I finally grabbed my bag and headed upstairs. My apartment was quiet, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint city noise drifting through the windows. I changed into sweatpants, made a cup of tea, and sat on the couch staring at my phone. No messages from Mom. No messages from Madison. Just one short text from Dad that had arrived while I was driving. Hope you got home safe. I stared at the message for a moment, then sent back a simple thumbs up emoji. Dad had always been like that. Not confrontational. Not cruel. Just quietly neutral. Sometimes neutrality can feel almost as lonely as opposition. But tonight I didn't feel angry. Mostly I felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. And if you've ever had a moment when a lifelong family pattern suddenly became obvious, you know how strange that feeling can be. Tell me something honestly. Would you have spoken up sooner than I did? Or would you have waited like I did, hoping someone else might finally notice? Because the truth is, someone had noticed. Grandma had been watching for years, and the conversation she and I would start having after that night would change far more than just a car. It would change the way I saw my place in the family. And my place in my own life. The silence from my family lasted longer than I expected. 1 day passed, then 3, then a full week. No calls from Mom, no texts from Madison. Even the usual family group chat stayed strangely quiet, as if everyone had silently agreed to avoid mentioning what had happened at the restaurant. At first, I kept checking my phone. Old habits. Part of me still expected my mother to call and explain everything away. She had always been good at that reframing events until the story sounded reasonable again. But the call never came. And slowly, something inside me began to relax. Without the constant pressure of family expectations, my apartment felt peaceful in a way it rarely had before. Work helped too. Freelance writing might not have impressed my mother, but it paid my bills and gave me something she had never understood: control over my time. Most mornings, I wrote from my kitchen table with coffee beside my laptop and sunlight filling the room. No one interrupting. No one rearranging my life for me. Still, the night at Rosewood stayed in the back of my mind. Not the confrontation. Not the documents. But the moment Grandma had looked at me and simply asked, "Did you give it away? Or was it taken?" It had been such a small question, yet somehow it had cracked open a truth I'd spent years quietly avoiding. 2 weeks after the party, my phone finally buzzed with Madison's name. Just one message. "Can we get coffee? I need to talk." I stared at the screen longer than I expected. Growing up, Madison and I had never really fought. Not because we were close, but because I usually stepped aside before things ever reached that point. Now things were different. I typed back slowly. "Okay." We agreed to meet the next morning at a small cafe near my apartment. When I arrived, Madison was already there. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and dark circles framed her eyes. Not the confident older sister I'd grown up watching from the sidelines. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup when I sat down. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked up at me, and the first thing she said surprised me. "I've been thinking a lot about what Grandma said." She paused. "About how I never asked you. Sometimes the hardest apologies aren't loud. They're the quiet ones that come after someone finally starts paying attention." Madison stared down into her coffee for a moment before continuing. Steam curled upward between us, soft and quiet in the early morning light of the cafe. "I keep replaying that night in my head," she said. "Every part of it." I didn't interrupt. For once, I wanted to hear what she would say without being nudged there by someone else. She exhaled slowly. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" "I didn't think about asking you," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but her eyes stayed fixed on the table. "It just never crossed my mind." The honesty of that statement stung more than I expected. Because it wasn't cruel. It was simply true. Madison finally looked up. "I've been trying to understand why." She shook her head slightly. "I think it's because Mom always handled everything." That part sounded familiar. She decided who needed help, who deserved what, who got what. Madison gave a small, tired laugh. And I just went along with it. I watched her carefully. "For years?" She nodded. "For years." A long pause settled between us. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You know what really hit me at the party?" "What?" "When Grandma read that letter." She swallowed. "The part where Mom wrote that you felt overlooked." My fingers tightened slightly around my mug. Madison's voice softened. "I think deep down I knew that already." I said nothing. "I just never wanted to look at it too closely," she admitted. Her eyes finally met mine. "I'm sorry, Arya." Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just real. "I should have asked you before taking the car." For the first time since we sat down, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen slightly. "I didn't need you to be perfect," I said. "I just needed you to see me." Madison nodded slowly. "I'm trying now." And maybe that was the beginning of something. Not a perfect sister relationship. Not instant forgiveness. But something quieter. More honest. Before we left the cafe, Madison hesitated. Then she said something that made me pause. "Grandma called me yesterday." "She did?" Madison nodded. "She told me something interesting." "What?" "She said the real lesson from that night wasn't about the car." Madison gave a small smile. It was about learning who gets to speak for themselves. She looked at me. I guess I'm learning that now too. Sometimes families don't change in one dramatic moment. Sometimes they change slowly, conversation by conversation. And what happened next with Grandma would show me just how much she meant that. But before we go further in the story, let me ask you something. If you were in Madison's position, would you have admitted you were wrong or stayed defensive? I'm genuinely curious, because the next chapter of this story didn't happen in a restaurant or a courtroom. It happened somewhere much quieter. In my grandmother's garden. The first Sunday I drove out to Grandma Eleanor's house after the party, I noticed how different the road felt. It was the same route I had taken before, same freeway exit, same quiet neighborhood lined with old maple trees. Same white house with the blue shutters and the deep front porch where she liked to sit in the late afternoon with a blanket over her knees and a cup of tea in her hands. But nothing in me felt the same. Before that night at Rosewood, my visits with Grandma had always carried a quiet secrecy to them. Not because we were hiding anything wrong, but because the closeness between us had somehow grown in the spaces my family never bothered to examine too carefully. We had our Sunday calls, our small jokes, our long conversations about books, weather, grief, gardens, and the strange things families pretend not to notice. Now I parked my SUV in her driveway openly. No one had to pretend anymore. When I stepped out, Grandma was already in the garden, trimming a rosebush with small silver clippers. She looked up, saw me, and smiled in that calm, knowing way she had. "There you are," she said. "And look at that. Your car found its way back to the correct address." I laughed, softer than I meant to. It did. She set the clippers down in a wicker basket and motioned for me to join her by the stone path. The garden looked exactly like her, careful, resilient, elegant without trying too hard. White roses climbed one fence. Lavender brushed the edges of the walkway. Everything had room to breathe. For a while we didn't talk about the party. We talked about ordinary things instead. A neighbor's new dog, a book she had just finished, the tomatoes that refused to behave this season. And somehow, that made me feel safer than if we had gone straight into the hard part. Finally, she poured tea into two mismatched cups and handed one to me. "You seem lighter," she said. I looked down at the steam rising between my hands. "I think I am." Grandma nodded as if she had expected that answer. That's what happens when truth stops living only inside your body. I sat very still after she said that. Because she was right. If this part of the story feels familiar, the quiet relief that comes after finally being seen, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes it helps to remember how many people understand this kind of silence. Grandma and I sat in her garden for a long time that afternoon. The sun had shifted just enough to warm the stone path beside us, and somewhere across the street a lawnmower hummed lazily. It was one of those quiet Sundays that didn't ask anything from anyone. For a while we just sipped tea. Then Grandma said something that caught me off guard. "You know," she said, gently turning her cup in her hands, "your mother wasn't always like this." I looked up. "She wasn't?" Grandma shook her head slowly. "No. When Linda was young, she was actually the one who felt overlooked." That surprised me. "Really?" "Yes," Grandma said. "Your Aunt Patricia was the loud one, the confident one, the one who took up space in every room." She gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Linda learned early that the easiest way to survive in a family like that was to become the one in control." I thought about that quietly. Control. It explained a lot. When people grow up feeling unseen, Grandma continued, they sometimes become the ones who decide who gets seen later. The sentence landed softly, but it stayed with me. "So Mom repeated the same pattern," I said. "In her own way," Grandma replied. She didn't sound angry, just honest. Patterns like that move through families unless someone stops them. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the faint scent of lavender. "And you think that someone might be me?" I asked. Grandma looked at me with a warm, steady gaze. "I think it already is." For a moment I didn't know what to say, because I had never imagined myself as the person who changed anything in this family. I had always been the one who adjusted, the one who stepped aside, the flexible one. Grandma reached across the small table and squeezed my hand. Strength doesn't always look like noise, Arya. She smiled gently. Sometimes it looks like a quiet boundary. I thought about the moment in the restaurant when I had said, "You ask me directly." That sentence had felt small when I said it, but now it felt important. Grandma leaned back in her chair, studying the garden. "Your grandfather used to say something similar," she added. "What did he say?" "That the calm ones usually understand the room better than anyone else." She looked at me again. "And eventually, they choose where they stand." If you've ever had a moment when you realized you didn't have to play the same role your family gave you growing up, you know how powerful that shift can be. Sometimes the biggest changes start quietly, one boundary at a time. And the next time my mother called me, that boundary would finally be tested. About a month after Grandma Eleanor's birthday dinner at Rosewood, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Mom. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. "Arya," she said when I picked up. Her voice was careful, the way people sound when they're trying to step around something sharp. "Hi, Mom." There was a small pause. "I think we should talk," she said. "This whole situation has gotten bigger than it needed to be." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window of my apartment. "The situation with my car?" I asked. Another pause. "Well, yes," she said. "But also everything that happened at your grandmother's party. I don't want this family falling apart over a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding landed strangely. Because nothing about that night had been unclear. "Mom," I said gently, "it wasn't a misunderstanding." Silence stretched on the line. Then she sighed. "I just think we should move forward." And in that moment I understood something important. Moving forward didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. It meant carrying the lesson with me. "I'm willing to move forward," I said calmly. "But things are going to be different now." Another pause. "What do you mean?" "You ask me," I said, "about my things, about my decisions, about my life." The line stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then Mom said, softly, "I suppose that's fair." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. And if you've ever had to set a quiet boundary with someone who wasn't used to hearing one, you know how much courage that can take. If this story felt familiar in any way, stay where you are understood. 6 months have passed since Grandma Eleanor's birthday at the Rosewood. Life didn't transform overnight. Families rarely change that way. But something quiet and steady did begin shifting after that night. My SUV is still parked in the same spot outside my apartment most mornings, the little silver compass charm gently tapping the steering column whenever I drive. Every time I hear it, I remember what that car really came to represent. Not a gift, not transportation, a boundary. Mom and I still talk, but carefully now. Our conversations are shorter, more measured. She no longer makes decisions for me without asking. It isn't warmth exactly, but it's respect. And for now, that's enough. Madison and I meet for coffee sometimes. She asks questions, now real ones, about my work, about my life. We're still learning how to be sisters without the old assumptions sitting between us. Dad remains the same quiet observer he's always been. I've accepted that too. But the biggest change has been with Grandma. Every Sunday afternoon I drive out to her house. We sit in the garden among the lavender and white roses, drinking tea while she tells stories about Grandpa and the strange ways families grow over time. One afternoon she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "You're not the flexible one anymore, Arya." She smiled. "You're the one who knows where she stands." And if you're listening right now, and this story reminded you that quiet strength still matters, remember this. Dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply stands its ground.